Okay, this is the second part of Skybright Acts, starting at the very bottom of page 16, top of page 17. White batter came pouring out onto the griddle, and soon the smell of crisp, brown, steaming pancakes was drifting across the whole state. There were tons of pancakes, with plenty left over for Babe, who could eat a carload in one gulp. There wasn't much Paul couldn't do, especially with Babe's help. But there was one job that seemed almost too hard, even for him. That was in Wisconsin, on the St. Croix River. The logging road there was so crooked it couldn't find its own way through the timber. It would start out in one direction, then turn around, and go every which way until it grew so snarled up it didn't know its beginning from its end. The teamsters hauling logs over it would start home for camp and meet themselves coming back. Maybe even Babe couldn't pull the kinks and curves out of a road as crooked as that one. Paul thought, but there was nothing to do but try. He gave Babe several extra pats as he put the blue ox's pulling harness on. Then he hitched Babe to the end of the road and stood back. Babe lowered his head and pushed his hoofs into the earth. His muscles stood out like rows of blue hills. He strained forward, pulling at the road. He stretched so hard that his hind legs spraddled out until his belly nearly scraped the ground. The road just lay there, stubborn as could be. "You can do it, my big, beautiful Babe," Paul said. Babe tried again. He strained so hard that his eyes nearly turned pink. He sweated so that water poured from the tips of his horns. He grunted and pulled, and his legs sank into the ground like mighty blue posts. There was a snap and then a loud crack. Paul saw the first kink come out of the road, and he cheered. The road kept fighting back, flopping around and trying to hold on to its crooked twists and turns, but it was no match for Babe. At last the road gave a kind of shiver and then lay still. Babe pulled it straighter than a railroad tie. Paul Bunyan's chest swelled up with pride, so with pride that it broke one of his suspenders. The broken suspender whizzed up into the sky like a long rubber band. Just then, thousands of wild ducks were flying overhead. The suspender wrapped itself around the ducks and strangled the whole flock. Paul felt sorry for the ducks, but there was nothing to do but gather them up and hand them over to the cooks. That night, after a wonderful duck dinner, Paul's bookkeeper, John Inkslinger, started writing down all that happened. He was busily scratching away with his pen when he saw that he had only 2 barrels of ink left. He asked Paul what to do. "That's easy," said Paul. "Don't bother to dot your I's or cross your T's. You'll save enough ink that way to get by until we can haul in another load of ink in the spring. Then you can fix up the I's and T's." Winter could be very cold there in Wisconsin and Minnesota. One year, Lake Superior froze solid from top to bottom. In the spring, Paul had to haul all the ice out of the lake and stack it up on shore to thaw. That same winter, men's words froze in front of their mouths and hung stiff in the air. Brimstone Bill, who was a great talker, was frozen in by a solid wall of words that turned to ice. Paul had to chip the ice from around Bill's shoulders, tie a rope to him, and have Babe pull him out. The greatest logging job Paul ever did was in North Dakota, where some of the trees were so tall it took a man a whole day to see up their tops. Shortly after Paul had finished logging off most of the white pine, spruce, and hemlock in Minnesota, he received a letter from the King of Sweden. Paul's Swedish blacksmith, Ole, read the letter to Paul. "The king says there are too many Swedes in Sweden. He wants to send a batch of them over here, but they need a rich farmland without many trees so they can raise wheat. He says they'll pay you in silver and gold if you can fix up the place for them." Paul thought a while, puffing on his pipe so hard that the sky began to cloud over. "North Dakota's the place," he said. "Nice and flat for farming. I'll fix it up for the Swedes. but I'm going to have to build the biggest logging camp ever built. There never was such building, banging, tree whacking, and hammering as went on in North Dakota when Paul started the new camp. Cookhouses, bunkhouses, and sheds grew up out of the ground, each building as big as a good-sized town. The dining room alone was so long that the man who brought the salt and pepper wagons around started out at one end in the morning and did not reach the other end until night. Paul had found that it was easier to skid logs on roads made slippery with ice. There weren't many lakes in North Dakota, so Paul hauled his water for freezing from Lake Superior. He put the water in a big tank which Babe pulled. The thousands of lakes in Minnesota today were made by Babe's hoofs sinking into the ground and the holes filling up with water that leaked out of the lake. On one trip, Babe slipped and the tank tipped over. All the water ran out and started the Mississippi River. On the day that Paul had cut down the last big tree in North Dakota, he stood looking around proudly. Then he frowned. Everywhere he looked, there were hundreds and thousands of stumps, top of page 20, sticking up. The Swedish farmers weren't going to like those stumps standing in the way of their plows. "Bless it all," Paul said, angry at himself for not having pulled the tree up, roots and all. "Blast," he thundered again, and brought his fist whistling down on the stump beside him. The stump sank a foot below the ground. Paul Bunyan stared, scratched the side of his head, and stomped off to find the Ole the blacksmith. "Ole," he said, "I want you to make me a maul, and make it as strong as Brimstone Bill's breath." The next morning, before the regular workday began, Paul went out with a new maul, which was like a giant hammer. He began knocking stumps down into the ground. After about 2 weeks, working a couple of hours each morning, he had hammered every stump into the earth. The King of Sweden was pleased when he heard about the fine job Paul had done, but one thing troubled him. He sent the Swedish ambassador to ask Paul if the soil in North Dakota was rich enough to grow fine crops. "I'll prove it is," said Paul. He got himself a kernel of corn, dug a hole 4 feet deep, and with the flick of his thumb and dropped the corn in. "You come back in a week," he told the king's messenger, "and you'll see a fat stalk of corn pushing up out of the ground." He started to walk off when he heard a rustling, whooshing sound behind him. Paul turned. The kernel of corn had already sprouted and was rising up like a green rocket. In 1 minute it grew as high as Paul Bunyan's eyebrows. In 2 minutes more its tip stuck a flying eagle and then split a cloud in two. The Swedish ambassador's false teeth jumped out of his mouth and started biting the ground in excitement. "You better stop that corn growing," he yelled at Paul. "It's apt to poke a hole in the sky and let all the air out. Besides, if I tell the king about it, he'll think it's just a story I made up." Paul called to his men. "Ole," he said when all the men arrived, "you climb up there fast and cut the top off." Ole straddled the stalk, but the thing was growing so fast it took Ole right along with it. Before Paul could think of what to do, Ole was out of sight. "Come on down," Paul yelled up at Ole. Ole was almost beyond hearing them. When he answered, his voice took an hour to fall back to earth. "I can't come down. For every 2 feet I climb down, it carries me up 10. Paul bit his ear, bit the ends of his whiskers, rubbed his forehead, and tried to think of what to do. He ordered Shotgun Gunderson to load his rifle with doughnuts and sourdough bread and shoot it up to Ole so that Ole wouldn't starve to death while waiting for Paul to rescue him. Finally, Paul took his biggest and brightest axe and began chopping at the base of the cornstalk. The stalk was growing so fast he couldn't hit the same place twice with his axe. He put a chain around the stalk, planning to have Babe pull the corn out by its roots. The stalk grew out of the chain and pulled it into the air before Paul could even call Babe. Paul remembered the iron rails that the men who had been building the Great Northern Railroad, had left lying beside the tracks. He marched off a few miles, picked up an armload of the rails, and came back. He tied the rails together, wrapped them around the cornstalk, and made a tight knot. The cornstalk grew fatter and thicker. With every foot the stalk grew, the iron hoop around it sank in deeper. "It's going to kill itself if it keeps on growing," said John Inkslinger. "It's going to cut itself in two." This is what the cornstalk did. It gave a shudder, at last started to sway. It was so tall that it took 3 days to hit the ground. Just before it hit, Ole jumped off, so he only fell 4 feet and didn't get a scratch. The Swedish ambassador wrote to the king that the soil seemed pretty rich, and the king sent Paul a shipload of money. Paul began looking around for an even bigger job. Most of the land nearby had been logged over, and there weren't many large forests left. Paul decided to go west to the Pacific Ocean. There were trees there so huge, called the Big Trees, that it took a day to walk around them. There were redwood trees and Douglas fir trees so tall that they were bent over from pressing against the sky. Paul told No, I lost my screen. Okay. Where am I at? Middle of page 22. Paul told his friends goodbye, and he and Babe started out for the west coast. On the way, Paul happened to let his peavey, a pole with a sharp spike on the end, drag along behind him. This made a rut that is now called the Grand Canyon. Farther on, heading through Oregon and Washington, Babe trampled some hills in the way that made the passes in the Cascade Mountains. When Paul Bunyan started lumbering in the west, the fir and redwoods began to fall like grass. He built one camp after another and invented all sorts of ways to make the lumbering business go faster. When the biggest part of the job was done, he grew restless again. He would go on and sit on a hill with the blue ox and think about the old days. Even when there was a gray in his beard now, and gray mixed in with the blue hairs on Babe's coat, Paul felt almost as young as ever. "We've had a good life, eh, Blue Babe?" Babe's soft blue eyes would shine, and he would push his damp muzzle against Paul Bunyan's cheek. "Yes, sir, Babe, old friend," said Paul on one of those starlit nights, with the wind crooning in the sugar pines. "It's too good a life to leave, so I guess we'll just keep on going as long as there's a toothpick of a tree left anywhere." Apparently that is what Paul Bunyan and his blue ox did. They just kept on going. The last time anyone saw them, they were up in Alaska, and people there say when the wind is right, they can still hear Paul whirling his sky-bright axe and sending the shout of "Timber!" booming across the air.